The first red flag came when a customer stormed into corporate headquarters, furious. "Your store refused my payment because I used coins," the man fumed. "They embarrassed me in front of other customers." Darren Thompson, the CEO, frowned as he listened. He had inherited the company from his father, who built it from the ground up. It had 9 locations across the state, but lately, complaints had been piling up. Bad service, mistreated employees, and now this? "I'm sorry this happened," Darren told the man sincerely. "I'll look into it." But he was tired of looking into things from behind a desk. Reports only told part of the story. He needed to see it himself. 2 days later, Darren walked into the store in question looking nothing like a CEO. His blonde hair was dyed brown, his beard was shaved, and he wore thick, rimmed glasses. He had never personally met the employees here. Store managers handled hiring, and with 9 locations, there was no way they could recognize him. He had applied as a trainee under the name Daniel Tucker, and within minutes, he was given a cheap name tag and a curt introduction from the store manager, a bald man in his 40s named Greg. "Don't waste my time," Greg said flatly. "Follow Marcus. He'll show you what to do." Marcus, a lanky guy in his 20s, gave a tired nod and led Darren to the back. The store was understaffed, and it showed. Shelves were half empty, customers were waiting too long at the registers, and employees looked drained. "Just keep the front stocked," Marcus muttered, rubbing his eyes. "They'll yell if it's empty." Darren noticed how exhausted Marcus looked. "You good man?" Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, sure, just worked a double yesterday." "Greg keeps cutting hours, but when people quit, he won't hire replacements, says it's not in the budget." Darren clenched his jaw. He had approved hiring more staff months ago. Where was the money going? As he worked, he saw more problems. Greg barked orders but never lifted a finger. He snapped at employees for taking too long to restock but refused to approve overtime. And then, Darren saw something that stopped him cold. In the back storeroom, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes was stacking boxes. Her hands were trembling. Moments later, her knees buckled. She collapsed, her body hitting the floor with a soft thud. Darren's heart pounded. He rushed forward but hesitated when she didn't move. Was she just resting? He waited, watching. She wasn't asleep. She was unconscious, and no one even knew. Darren dropped to one knee beside the unconscious woman, his pulse hammering. He didn't know her name, but that didn't matter right now. He reached out, shaking her shoulder gently. No response. He quickly looked around, but the storeroom was empty. The store's low hum of activity was muffled by the thick walls. No one had seen this happen. No one would have known if he wasn't here. He tried again, firmer this time. "Hey, can you hear me?" A faint, sluggish groan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered before she forced them open, her gaze unfocused and glassy. Darren exhaled, relieved she was conscious. "You passed out," he said. "Are you hurt?" She blinked, confusion flickering across her face before realization set in. Immediately, she tried to sit up, but her arms trembled under her weight. Darren steadied her, keeping his grip light enough to let her move on her own. I'm fine," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "You just collapsed," he pointed out. "That's not fine." She inhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I just got dizzy," she murmured. "It happens sometimes." Darren studied her. She was pale, her breathing still shallow. He glanced at a nearby shelf and spotted a half-empty bottle of water. He grabbed it and handed it to her. "Drink." She hesitated but eventually took a sip, then another. Some color returned to her face, but she still looked unsteady. "What's your name?" he asked. Her fingers tightened around the bottle. "Emily." "How long have you been working today?" She hesitated. "Since this morning." Darren glanced at his watch. It was early evening. "You've been here all day." She gave a weak nod. "Greg called me in last minute." "Someone quit. And you didn't get a break." Emily let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Breaks," she shook her head. "Not really an option here." Darren's jaw tightened. He had built this company to provide stable jobs, not to push employees to the point of collapse. "Has this happened before?" he asked. Emily stared at the floor. That was answer enough. Before he could press further, footsteps echoed from the hallway. A second later, the storeroom door swung open and Greg stepped in. His eyes landed on Emily sitting on the floor, then flicked to Darren crouched beside her. Greg's expression twisted into irritation. "What's going on?" Darren stood, keeping himself between Greg and Emily. "She passed out." Greg's frown deepened. "Why?" Darren folded his arms. "She's been working all day without a break. Probably dehydrated, maybe exhausted, you tell me." Greg scoffed. "She's fine." Emily pushed herself upright, gripping a shelf for balance. I can keep working," she said quickly. Darren shot her a sharp look. "You're not going back to work." "You need to sit down, eat something." He turned back to Greg. Why was she scheduled for such a long shift without a break? Greg's irritation shifted into indifference. "That's how it is. We're short-staffed. If people actually showed up when we scheduled them, we wouldn't have this problem." Darren clenched his fists. "That's not an excuse to overwork the ones who do show up." Greg let out a tired sigh. "Look, if she wanted a break, she should have said something." Emily flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around the water bottle. Darren caught the movement and understood immediately. She had said something before. It just hadn't mattered. Greg crossed his arms. "If she's feeling weak, she can go home. No one's forcing her to be here." Darren's first instinct was to snap back, but he forced himself to stay controlled. Losing his temper wouldn't help. "You expect her to just leave mid-shift?" Darren asked. "Would you cover for her?" Greg let out a short laugh. "That's not my job." Darren inhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He had seen enough. He turned to Emily. "Go home," he said. "Take care of yourself." Emily hesitated. "But I'll make sure you're covered," he cut in. She searched his face before nodding, her exhaustion winning over her reluctance. Greg didn't protest, but Darren could see the irritation in his stance. As Emily left, Darren's mind was already racing. He had come here expecting issues, but this was worse than he thought. People weren't just overworked, they were afraid to speak up. And that had to change. Darren watched as Emily disappeared through the stockroom doors, her steps slow but determined. His chest tightened. No one should have to push themselves to that point just to keep a job. Greg leaned against a stack of boxes, arms crossed, eyes scanning Darren like he was an inconvenience rather than a new trainee. The man's entire demeanor radiated indifference, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a minor disruption. "She'll be fine," Greg muttered. "Some people just don't know how to handle a tough shift." Darren forced himself to stay composed, or maybe they're being pushed past their limits. Greg let out a short breath, clearly uninterested in the argument. "Look, if you're done playing hero, we've got work to do." Darren didn't move. His mind was racing through everything he had seen since stepping into this store. The empty shelves, the overworked employees, the dismissive attitude from management, none of it aligned with the values he had built the company on. And then there was the biggest question of all. Why was the store this understaffed when the corporate budget had allowed for more hires? "How many people are actually on schedule today?" Darren asked. Greg gave him a sideways glance. "Enough, you're here, aren't you?" "That's not an answer." Greg pushed off the boxes and walked toward the stockroom exit, clearly done with the conversation. "You're new, just do what you're told." Darren's eyes followed Greg as he left, his jaw tightened. He needed more information. Stepping out of the stockroom, Darren returned to the floor, slipping back into the role of a trainee. The minutes blurred into hours as he stocked shelves, observed interactions, and listened. Employees spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was paying attention. Customers muttered complaints under their breath. It didn't take long to piece together the full picture. Greg was cutting hours aggressively, blaming corporate for budget restrictions that didn't exist. Employees were being denied breaks, pushed to exhaustion, and given no real avenue to complain without fearing retaliation. Worse, those who spoke up found their hours slashed further until they had no choice but to quit. The turnover rate was staggering. Darren caught snippets of conversations throughout the day, frustrated whispers between cashiers, quiet venting near the stockroom. They expect us to do the work of 3 people, but they won't hire more. He told me I could leave if I didn't like it, like I can afford to just quit. I saw Emily earlier. She looked awful. Did she even get a break? Darren took it all in, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. The final straw came near closing time. Darren had just finished straightening up an aisle when he heard raised voices near the registers. He turned the corner and saw Greg standing behind the front counter, glaring at a young cashier who looked barely out of high school. "You're short again," Greg snapped. The girl swallowed hard. I don't know how, I counted twice." Greg shook his head, his expression darkening. "You think that matters? If the drawer's short, it's on you." Darren stepped forward before he could stop himself. "What's the problem?" Greg turned, eyes narrowing. "Not your concern." Darren ignored him and looked at the cashier. "How much is missing?" She hesitated, then barely whispered, $20. Darren glanced at the register screen. The system was outdated, prone to errors. He knew that he had been meaning to approve an upgrade months ago. "You checked the receipts?" Darren asked. The girl nodded quickly. "Twice." "Everything matches." Greg let out an irritated sigh. "Then she pays for it." Darren felt something snap inside him. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice calm but firm. Greg folded his arms. "That's exactly how it works. If the till is short, someone's responsible." Darren held his ground. "Or maybe your system glitched again. You ever consider that?" Greg scoffed. "You think corporate's gonna care about some glitch? They want the numbers right. She's paying for it or she's gone." The cashier looked down, her hands shaking. That was it. Darren took a slow breath, then spoke clear, unmistakable. "She's not paying for it, and you're done here." Greg laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Darren reached up and pulled off the cheap name tag clipped to his shirt. He didn't need it anymore. "I'm Darren Thompson." His voice carried through the store, steady and absolute. "CEO of this company." Silence crashed over the room. The cashier's eyes widened. Employees froze mid-task. Customers glanced over, sensing something big was happening. Greg's face drained of color. He let out a nervous laugh. "You're joking." Darren didn't blink. "No, I'm not." Greg's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Darren arrived, there was no arrogance in his stance. Darren turned to the cashier. "You're fine. You're not responsible for this." She nodded quickly, looking like she hardly believed what was happening. Then Darren faced Greg again. "I want you in the office. Now." Greg hesitated, then stiffly turned and walked toward the back. Darren followed, each step solid with purpose. This was over. And it was time to clean house. Darren shut the office door behind him, leaving the quiet hum of the store behind. Greg stood near the desk, his usual arrogance replaced with stiff unease. The man's eyes darted toward the chair as if debating whether to sit, but he stayed on his feet. Darren didn't offer him the choice. "You've been cutting staff hours despite corporate approving more hires," Darren stated. "Where's that money going?" Greg's jaw tightened. "I manage labor costs. If I didn't, this store would be bleeding money." Darren held his gaze. "That's not an answer." Greg let out a slow breath, folding his arms across his chest. "Look, corporate doesn't see what happens on the ground. I do. These employees. Half of them don't work hard enough to justify full shifts. I keep the ones who can handle it." Darren's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Emily passed out in the stockroom. You knew she was struggling and you did nothing." Greg's expression barely shifted. "She pushed herself too hard. That's on her." Darren stepped forward, his voice lowering. "No, that's on you." Greg's shoulders squared, but he didn't speak. Darren continued. "I built this company to give people stable jobs. You've turned this store into a revolving door of overworked, underappreciated employees." Greg exhaled sharply. "You think you can just throw money at hours and make everything run smoothly? If I let them take breaks whenever they wanted, we'd never get anything done." Darren's patience thinned. "A break isn't a luxury, it's the law." Greg's lip curled slightly. And what happens when half the staff is on break and customers are waiting? You get complaints, and corporate hates complaints. Darren shook his head. The only reason this store is struggling is because of how you run it. People quit because they're treated like they don't matter. Then you pile their work onto whoever's left and act shocked when things fall apart. Greg's silence was telling. Darren let it settle for a moment before speaking again. You've been blaming corporate for budget cuts that don't exist. Employees are afraid to speak up because they know you'll cut their hours if they do. That ends today. Greg's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Darren reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward Greg. Your termination notice, Darren said, effective immediately. Greg's face darkened. You're serious. Darren didn't blink. Get your things and leave. Greg's fingers twitched at his sides. You think you can find someone who'll take this job and not run into the same problems? Go ahead. Watch how fast this place falls apart without me. Darren's voice was steady. It's already falling apart because of you. Greg let out a breath through his nose, then grabbed the paper. He didn't argue further. He knew there was no point. Darren watched him for a moment before stepping aside, letting Greg walk past him. The man hesitated briefly at the door, but when he saw Darren wasn't going to stop him, he left. The office felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of Greg's presence had been pressing down on it for too long. Darren exhaled and turned to the desk. He picked up the phone and dialed HR. Greg is out, he said the moment the line connected. I need a new store manager here by tomorrow, someone who understands leadership. The voice on the other end didn't ask questions. Understood. Darren hung up and stepped out of the office. The employees were gathered near the registers, whispers buzzing between them. When they saw him, the murmurs stopped. He met their stares head-on. Greg is gone, he said. Things are going to change. A few exchanged glances, some skeptical, some relieved. Darren continued. Breaks will be enforced. Hours will be balanced. No more retaliation for speaking up. If you have concerns, they will be heard. Marcus, the lanky employee who had trained Darren that morning, folded his arms. And how do we know this isn't just talk? Darren nodded toward the office. Because I'll be here personally to make sure it happens. A few employees straightened at that. Marcus studied him, then gave a slow nod. Darren turned toward the exit. Tomorrow we start fresh. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he knew this was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he was certain the future of his company was back on the right track. Darren arrived at the store early the next morning, just as the first shift was clocking in. He had spent the night reviewing everything: staffing reports, financial records, customer complaints. The more he dug, the clearer it became just how much Greg had twisted operations to suit his own control. Now, it was time to set things right. The employees were wary when they saw him again. Some avoided eye contact, others watched carefully, unsure of what to expect. Darren didn't blame them. Promises meant nothing when they had been ignored for so long. He spotted Marcus near the stockroom, speaking quietly with another worker. Darren made his way over. Marcus turned as Darren approached, his eyes scanning him with the same cautious skepticism as the night before. The other employee, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a tired stance, crossed her arms. Darren got straight to the point. Greg is done. I meant what I said. Things are changing starting today. The woman let out a slow breath. We've heard that kind of thing before. Darren nodded. I get that, but you're going to see it, not just hear it. Marcus exhaled through his nose. All right, then let's see what you've got. Darren had already made his first decision before even stepping inside. Emily's shift has been adjusted. She's on the schedule, but she's getting lighter hours this week while she recovers, and if she needs more time, she'll get it. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge whether Darren was serious. The woman beside him gave a short nod, approval creeping into her expression. Darren continued. We're hiring immediately. No more running this place on skeleton crews. I've already got HR working on it, but in the meantime, I need to know who's been pulling the most weight. The people who have held this store together despite everything. Marcus didn't hesitate. Sandra, Miguel, and Tara, and Emily, obviously, they've been keeping this place from falling apart. The woman beside him, Sandra, apparently gave a nod of agreement. Tara's been running registers and stocking between rushes. Miguel's basically been acting as a supervisor without the title or the pay. And Emily. She hesitated, then exhaled. She works like she's scared of stopping. Like if she slows down, someone's going to take her off the schedule entirely. Darren's stomach tightened at that. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it worse. "That's going to change," he said simply. Sandra studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." Marcus shifted, glancing toward the stockroom. What about the money Greg was supposedly saving by cutting hours? Where's that been going? Darren had spent hours trying to answer that very question. Now he had a partial answer. Greg was padding his own performance numbers, making it look like he was running the store efficiently by cutting costs. His bonuses were tied to hitting certain targets: labor, waste, profit margins. Every time he cut a shift or denied overtime, it made him look more efficient to corporate. On paper, he was running this store better than anyone else. Sandra's expression darkened. So the worse things got for us, the better it was for him. Darren nodded. Exactly. Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head, and corporate didn't see it. Darren tightened his jaw. Not soon enough. Sandra leaned against the stockroom door. So what now? Darren met her gaze. Now we make things right. It started immediately. The hiring process was expedited with interviews scheduled for the next day. Employee schedules were adjusted to balance workloads. Breaks were strictly enforced, but the most critical part was ensuring that the employees felt safe speaking up. Darren gathered the staff in the break room later that morning. Some sat with their arms crossed, others leaned against the walls. All of them looked hesitant, like they were waiting for the catch. Darren didn't waste time. "I know trust isn't built overnight, but I need you all to understand something: this store doesn't run without you. You're not disposable. You're not numbers on a spreadsheet. You are the reason customers come back, the reason this company exists." A few employees exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Darren continued. "Going forward, I want every employee to have a direct line to corporate if they need it. No more waiting for a manager to approve complaints. If something isn't right, you say something, and you'll get a response." One of the cashiers, a younger guy with a cautious expression, spoke up. "And what happens if the next manager is just another Greg?" Darren met his gaze. "Then they won't last long." Silence stretched for a beat, then Sandra gave a single nod. "All right," she said. "Let's see if you mean it." Darren knew that earning their trust wouldn't happen in a day, but this was the first step. By the end of the shift, the store felt different. Employees weren't rushing through tasks with the same frantic energy. Breaks were taken without fear. Customers were still coming in at their usual pace, but the tension that had clung to the air the day before had eased. Darren stood near the registers, watching as Tara handled a rush with practiced efficiency. Miguel restocked shelves without the exhaustion weighing on every movement, and Marcus spoke to a new hire with genuine patience. Then he spotted Emily. She had come in for her shift despite her lighter schedule. She moved carefully, not overexerting herself but still working. Darren approached her. She noticed him and straightened unconsciously. "Mr. Thompson." Darren shook his head. "Darren." She hesitated, then nodded. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Emily glanced at the shelves she had been organizing. "Better." Darren studied her for a moment. "You don't have to prove anything by pushing yourself too hard," she swallowed. I don't want to be seen as weak." Darren's voice softened. "Needing rest isn't weakness, and no one here is going to punish you for it." Emily held his gaze, searching for any sign of dishonesty. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Darren nodded back. As he stepped away, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still work to do, still trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, the foundation was solid.